3:55 a.m., the kind of hour when the world is silent, but somewhere deep in western Russia, history is about to explode. A few miles outside the small city of Arzamas, a dark factory hums quietly, its workers asleep, machines cooling after another long night building the brains behind Russia's most powerful cruise missiles. But hundreds of miles away, four tiny dots flicker on a Ukrainian operator's screen. Four cheap FPV drones worth less than the price of a car, and within minutes, they'll humiliate one of the most expensive air defense networks on Earth. This isn't just another strike. It's a digital David versus Goliath story, where a handful of drones, guided by AI and fiber optics, slip through the cracks of Russia's billion-dollar Golden Dome. What happened next didn't just destroy a building, it exposed a terrifying weakness in Russia's entire military machine. Deep in the industrial heart of Arzamas stood a building few civilians had ever heard of, the Arzamas Instrument Building Plant. On the surface, it looked ordinary, a dull Soviet-era structure surrounded by rusted fences and snow-dusted roads. But inside, it was something far more dangerous. This was the nerve center of Russia's long-range missile production, responsible for crafting the delicate guidance systems for weapons like the Kh-101 and Kh-32, the same missiles that had been pounding Ukrainian cities for months. Without these guidance brains, those missiles were nothing more than expensive metal tubes, blind, aimless, and useless. For decades, this plant was untouchable. Moscow's generals believed it was protected by the world's most advanced air defenses, the famous S-400 systems in layers of radar coverage, forming what they proudly called the Golden Dome. But in 2025, that illusion started to crack. Russia had stretched its defenses thin, sending its best missile interceptors and radar systems to the front lines of the war. The skies above Arzamas, once thick with electronic shields, were suddenly empty. What was left behind was laughable: a few short-range jammers and outdated radar arrays, barely enough to stop a hobby drone. And Ukraine's intelligence officers noticed. Using satellite images and recon drones, they discovered the terrifying truth. One of Russia's most critical military factories was practically naked. No S-400 launchers, no Panzer systems, just an aging Krasuka 4 jammer, the electronic equivalent of a rusty padlock on a billion-dollar vault. In that moment, a plan was born. Why waste million-dollar missiles on heavily fortified bunkers when the crown jewels of the enemy were left sitting unguarded in the open? Ukraine didn't need firepower, it needed precision and creativity. They found the gap and they didn't hesitate. Satellite passes, intercepted chatter, and low-flying recon drones painted the same picture. The defenses around Arzamas had been hollowed out. Where once there might have been layers of missile batteries and overlapping radar, there were now holes, blind spots big enough to drive a truck through. The front line needed the S-400s and Panzer systems, the rear got scraps. What remained at the plant was essentially a single electronic sentry, the Krasuka 4, a mighty name for a system that could only jam radio waves. It could blind sensors, scramble signals, and make radios scream with static. It could not, though, protect a building from a drone flying just above the treetops. That's the beauty of a weakness. It's obvious once you see it. Ukraine's analysts didn't just note the absence of high-end interceptors. They mapped the angles, the approach corridors, the blind arcs created by terrain and deployed hardware. They timed patrols. They tracked shift changes. They watched the little things that reveal big opportunities: a gap between radar cones, a guard rotation that left one side thin, a maintenance window when the jammer was at full power but everyone assumed it's working. The conclusion was brutal and simple. The plant's crown jewels could be reached without facing the Kremlin's frontline defenses. So they stopped thinking like an air force and started thinking like a garage engineer. If you can't beat a fortress head-on, you ask where the fortress is weakest and then you pry there. 4 drones. That was the whole plan. Not a fleet, not a missile barrage. 4 FP-class strike drones, each cheap enough to be disposable, each altered for one purpose: get in low, move fast, and stop the factory from building brains. Cost? A fraction of what a single missile costs. Impact? Potentially catastrophic. The operation relied on a paradox: do the most damage by being the least obvious. Rather than climbing into the upper atmosphere and and facing layers of trackers. These drones hugged the terrain at 40 feet or less, following riverbeds, tree lines, and the curvature of the land. At that altitude, most civilian and military radars either miss them entirely or mistake them for ground clutter. It's hard to intercept what you can't see. Low flight creates other problems: power lines, barns, telephone masts. The world is full of things that will end a drone in seconds. The fix was ugly and elegant at once. Lightweight AI navigation running preloaded digital terrain elevation maps and obstacle avoidance. Nothing mystical, no omniscient neural net, just brutally effective automation. Compare the drone's camera to stored 3D maps, steer around obstacles, keep to the corridor. It turned each drone into a one-way, low-level missile that could think a step ahead of a tree branch. They also engineered redundancy into simplicity. Send 4 from slightly different directions and you force defenders to split their attention. Track 1 and another clips the edge. Fire at 2 and 2 more pass. It was a math problem, not a duel of hardware. Overload the decision loop and the expensive air defense becomes indecisive. But there was one more twist, something that would make Russia's jammers almost irrelevant. Instead of relying on radio links that can be blinded, these drones used fiber optic tethering for the critical phases. Think of it like plugging the drone directly into the operator's console. You can't jam a physical wire the way you jam the airwaves. The trade-off was brutal. The spool added weight and drag, and it made escape impossible. The drone that plugs in is a drone that comes back only in pieces. For this mission, that was acceptable. With navigation solved and communications hardened, the plan boiled down to timing and choreography. All that was left was to launch, cross 500 miles of contested airspace at whisper height, and hope the sequence, 4 tiny machines against a mighty system, would be enough. What happened as they closed in would test every assumption Russia had made about how to protect its crown jewels. They called it simple, but it moved like a ghost. For 500 miles, the drones didn't rely on GPS or a radio whisper. Instead, each carried a tiny autopilot trained on a 3D map of the Earth. Digital terrain elevation data loaded like a cheat sheet. Picture a Roomba with military-grade focus. See an obstacle? Steer around it. Compare the camera to the map, correct course. Repeat 1,000 times. No satellite lock, no live guidance, just onboard vision matched to a stored picture of the world. Flying at 40 feet, the drones rode the landscape, hugging river cuts, slipping under ridge lines, disappearing in treetop shadows. That low profile made them almost invisible to the big radars tuned for high-speed threats. It also turned the landscape into a minefield: power lines, barns, chimneys, unexpected poles. The AI didn't solve physics. It outsmarted small hazards with relentless, simple decisions. Keep forward, avoid crash, make the target. That tiny brain came with heartbreaking efficiency. It didn't need complex reasoning. It needed repeatability. It needed to do one task perfectly: arrive. And when paired with a human who could trigger the final arming, it became the perfect blunt instrument: cheap, predictable, and almost impossible to stop with traditional defenses. Low-level flight and smart obstacle avoidance got them to the doorstep, but getting in the door meant beating Russia's last electronic watchdog, and that would require a trick no jammer could anticipate. On the maps, it had an intimidating name: Krasuka 4. In practice, it was an electronic roar, a system built to turn radios into hiss and radar returns into smear. For Russia, it was the last real line of defense around the plant. Loud, expensive, and meant to make approaching drones vanish into static. But the Ukrainians didn't try to outshout it. They rewired the rules. Instead of a vulnerable radio link, the strike team ran a fiber optic tether from controller to drone for the mission's critical moments, like plugging a device straight into the wall while the jammer screamed at the airwaves. A physical wire cannot be turned into noise by an electronic gun. The Krasuka could blanket the sky with static and still see nothing but empty air on its operator's screens. That choice came with cost. The cable slowed them down and left left a visible trail. It made escape and recovery improbable, but it also made jamming useless. When the plant's defenders unleashed a blizzard of electronic interference, two of the drones stayed crisp on the operator's console, video stable, controls intact, as if the jammer were blowing into a closed room. Russia tried everything it had left: electronic pulses, local generators spitting non-kinetic energy. For a heartbeat, one link died. A drone's feed wandered into static and then cut to black. An unshielded machine fell away in a smoking arc and crashed into a field. It looked like the plan had been broken. But the physics of the mission were stacked to survive that exact moment. The fiber optic protected drones didn't need constant radio. The others had switched to onboard vision and kept crawling forward. The jammer could scream until dawn, and it still wouldn't pull them off their path. The electronic shield had failed as a shield. With one drone down and three still inbound, the strike moved from trick to execution, and the factory's fate flipped in minutes.